Thanks everybody for coming. I'm excited about today's panel. My name is Jian DeLeon. I'm the men's fashion editorial director at Nordstrom. I like to say I'm a bit of a recovering editor. Prior to joining the Nordstrom team, I served as the editorial director of High Sobriety. I was at GQ and a contributor to Business of Fashion, as well as a slew of other fashion publications. But my time at High Sobriety certainly gave me an interesting purview over the evolution of something that we came to call the new luxury in the course of over a decade in the men's fashion and lifestyle space. You know, we've seen the aesthetics of streetwear and multiple subcultures go from subculture to pop culture and become a driving force in the luxury sphere and beyond today. I'm sure, you know, the recent announcements of people like Luigi Villaseñor, Rude joining Bally, Ferragamo just presented their new show at Fashion Week, and of course, the legendary icon and recently departed Virgil Abloh and his impact on the luxury world, the horology world, and beyond. You know, even touching automotive. You know, there's a Mercedes project I think he just released, and a whole slew of things that he touched that are really just starting to see the light of day. And that's a bit of what this panel is about. But it's called The People versus Luxury, but I think it's a slightly more nuanced conversation than that. In 2019, I edited this book for High Sobriety called The New Luxury, defining the aspirational in the age of hype. And among other things, it posited that for newer consumers especially, the idea of the word luxury wasn't specifically about what you wore, what you bought, what you were into, as much as what you knew about it and what kept you enthusiastic about those topics. And as I mentioned, subculture in many ways has become pop culture, and so many codes have been rewritten and redefined, and we're still seeing that on a daily basis, from house codes at previously aforementioned luxury houses like Louis Vuitton, Kim Jones, at Dior, the work of global creative director at Tiffany, Ruba Amunema, that we're starting to see now, to dress codes at offices everywhere, and even social clubs like the Yale Club. And of course, with the rise of cryptocurrency and NFTs, like literal code is being rewritten and influencing the way we think about luxury and its relationship with the consumer and that line between access and aspiration. And so this panel will look at this new paradigm through the lens of horology, which now has analogs in multiple collector communities where that line between this sort of enthusiastic hobby and valuable commodity continues to blur. And from high-end sneaker collaborations to privileges of so-called holders of NFTs and certain clubs where there's alternate methods of demonstrating membership, which we'll talk about for sure with Gabe Reilly as well. So there's never been more to discuss when it comes to how we define luxury today and how it continues to contrast and in some ways enhance a more classic perspective on what we collectively come to call taste. And so that'll bring us to our lovely panelists. Here is Rebecca Ross, currently the head of watch sales at Christie's, correct? So she developed her eye working in numerous art galleries and museums. She's also a dear friend who has an interesting perspective on this world. Of course, you just did a panel here about the new luxury and new age collectors. So yeah, we'll definitely dive into that. We also have Mark Cho, who in many ways is an avatar of that sort of new collector who balances the classic sensibility with a modern taste level. He's the proprietor of the Armoury and co-proprietor of Drake's, two brands that straddle the line between menswear and horology. And sort of what I like about him is the way that he sees watch collecting is influenced by his taste in clothing, which of course is where my expertise lies and sort of where my main enthusiasm lies. And so I think his perspective on the people versus luxury and how luxury has evolved, given that tailoring, people always question where it's going, and now given post-pandemic dressing, a lot of us here are wearing sport coats and blazers and suits, and so it's definitely come back with a vengeance. And then we have Gabe of Collective Horology. Now, Gabe Reilly, he's the co-founder of Collective Horology. It's a Silicon Valley-based collectors community based on exclusive watch collaborations where owners of watches can be part of this unique community. So let's kick it off. When I wrote the new luxury book, one of the first questions I asked many of the subjects was, what was your first luxury purchase? Because it showed the elasticity of what the word meant. One of my favorite responses was Hiroshi Fujiwara, so-called godfather of Japanese streetwear, who mentioned that his first luxury purchase was actually notebooks from Tiffany. And when he was at Tiffany, he actually saw co-branded Mont Blanc pens and co-branded Rolex watches, which gave him this notion of, well, why would Tiffany work with these brands rather than making it themselves? And it was explained to him that, well, we can't make the best watch in the world. We can't make the best pen in the world. Why not team up with someone who's already doing that and give our own Tiffany signature on it? And in some ways, that actually served as the inspiration for a lot of the collaborations that he would go on to do later in his career that are typically classified as streetwear, but ultimately touch different worlds. So let's just go around. Mark, let's start with you. What was your first luxury purchase?
My first luxury purchase, I bought an
luxury in quotes.
Luxury watch would be a Rolex. I bought a Rolex Explorer 1 in 2011 as kind of just celebrating the fact that I had opened the Armoury and managed to get Drakes off the ground and it was going all right. But my first luxury purchase, probably a bit earlier, I bought an olive-colored leather coat, which was not a great choice, to be honest, from Ted Baker. And I was like, wow, this is really expensive, and wow, this is really unnecessary. And I think there's a lot of luxury, given how unnecessary it was, But it was cool. I liked it. Yeah.
Rebecca?
My first luxury watch was not an expensive one. It was a Swatch. And the reason I mention it now is because I was only probably 10 years old, just a little girl in London. And the watch allowed me to enter the foray of luxury. It wasn't an expensive, shiny new toy, as people think of luxury sometimes. But it was something that allowed me the knowledge in a new hobby. It allowed me to enter the world of horology in a way, and that ignited a passion in me. And I think having that opportunity is what was really luxurious for me.
Gabe?
Yeah, I don't know my first luxury purchase, but I do remember my first luxury possession, which was a watch. My high school girlfriend's dad was a very interesting guy, but a watch collector. And I remember I was at their house one day, and he comes downstairs from his bedroom with a giant Ziploc bag that is filled with watches. I'd never seen anything like this. I pretty much figured watches were useless and antiquated, and I couldn't imagine that anyone would have so many, much less keep them in a Ziploc bag. And he rummages through the bag and pulls out a Cartier Santos tank watch and gives it to me. And not only did that send me down a very dark rabbit hole in life, so we can blame him, but I remember feeling the weight of that gift. It felt not just luxurious, because I'd heard of Cartier, but it felt very rich, and it felt, it carried with it a weight and a significance that even though I knew nothing about watches, I could just feel. And then, of course, it set off a lot of curiosity.
I just want to interject, because all you guys have brought up things to do with milestones, actually, right? Like even myself too.
Right.
And despite the fact that I always think of luxury as kind of trivial, because I think that kind of keeps your head on your shoulders a little bit. They are necessary in a certain way, as a way to congratulate yourself, or as a way for you to congratulate someone else. Like I always say to people, if you're going to buy a gift for someone, the best sort of gifts are the ones that you want, but you would never buy for yourself. And luxury ties into that a lot, I think.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback off of that and just say that I think it's a big aspiration. Luxury is having an aspiration to acquire these pieces. Just looking at my dad's collection, it wasn't, again, the most expensive collection, but it was varied. It was something to aspire to having.
It's part of growing up, I guess.
Yeah, it's part of having milestones and growing up, to your point.
Yeah, Mark, what you're getting at, right, is something I've been thinking about lately, which is this idea of vicarious consumerism, in a way. And we're going to talk about that later, because you're actually selling a lot of your collection, which we'll talk about. But before we get to that, we've talked about luxury. It's almost a dirty word, right? It's one of those things that when you say it now, what does it actually mean? And so I'm curious, what does luxury mean to you now?
You should start.
What does luxury mean now? Well, I don't think it's the most expensive item anymore. I don't think it's elitist anymore. I think it's inclusive. I think it means community. I think it means sharing and learning and coming together and teaching each other. And I think it means self-expression. And I really hope that it can continue in that direction, because I think that when you acquire a luxury item, you can create a relationship with that piece. And that's what luxury, I think, should be.
Gabe or Mark?
Sure. For me, look, you guys hit on this. Everyone has a different sense of what's luxurious. For me, it's access. That's luxury. Being able to have access to people, to things, information, experiences. To me, access is what defines luxury.
I'm not crazy about the word luxury because obviously it's pretty overused. It's kind of lost a lot of its context. But personally, what I wish luxury would be is just when you go to a store and they really take care of you and you get an item and you feel like this is special, like I think that somewhere between the human connection and then the feeling that's generated from owning this item that is not a common feeling, like something that lives in a new echelon in your life, like that to me is luxury.
One of the books I've been reading lately is David Marks' latest book, Status and Culture, where he posits that he wants to demystify this whole quote-unquote grand mystery of culture. And there's a chapter about status symbols, which he defines must meet 3 criteria. The first is a signaling cost. Basically, it's either very expensive or looks aspirational. Cachet, it means something very aspirational. And the third is the most interesting, which I want to talk about, is it has to have an alibi. Like, you have to have a plausible deniability as to why you would treat something like an investment or make such an extravagant purchase. And in today's world, to what degree is a watch's accuracy and the complications and its ability to tell time still a valid alibi in a world where we have watches on several screens at once?
I mean, it's an interesting flex, right? To be able to say that you have the most accurate watch in the room is, it's trivial in some ways, but I can see why it is meaningful and important to other ways. I think that alibis are a really important part of not just how it relates to status, but just of day-to-day life, right? Like in day-to-day life, we live our lives via narratives, and so the alibi is part of the narrative. The narrative of me owning these watches is not only do I appreciate them aesthetically, but I like how they express me as a person in the clothing that I wear. Because I'm always concerned with that. That's a big part of my life. It's like when I look at someone, when someone looks at me, I'm always thinking about, oh, how do they look? And how do I look to them?
I think, being able to tell the time with your watch is the baseline, right? But then there are other things that go on top of it which really define the value in that watch, from how the case was assembled to how the dial was made, and the complexity of the movement, for example. Some of my clients at Christie's actually don't acquire watches to tell the time at all. They really see them as pieces of art, as collectibles, no less than a Picasso painting or sheet music from Mozart. I mean, and they display them up on the wall sometimes. I mean, they're not even on the wrist. So I think it's important to remember that these are pieces of art, that there's a lot of time and energy that goes into making them, and just telling the time is really the beginning.
I think, there's watches aren't one thing. There's watches in culture in general. And, I think in that context, when the average person thinks about watches, they think about signaling, status symbol, well-made objects, fancy stuff, luxury. But then there's watches in watch culture. And it's interesting, like, the more into watch culture we get, the definition of status and a flex starts to change. So, in watch culture, a flex might be having a quartz Grand Seiko watch that's accurate, within 5 seconds a year. That's a flex. that's not a flex, out on a Saturday night in the meatpacking district. So within the watch culture, like Rebecca was saying, there's different subcultures within watch culture. There are people who come at it from a design standpoint, people who are really curious about material innovation or tool watches, people who are really interested in the craft and the artistry of it. So I think what's so cool is the more you get into watch culture, actually a lot of that stuff just starts to disappear. And the more people come at watches from a place of enthusiasm, it's not that there isn't signaling and flexing. It starts to change and, I don't know, maybe at least become a little bit more interesting.
Well, I think that's what's so exciting about watches for everybody in this room is that the more you get into it, there are so many new perspectives you can appreciate it from, right? The country of origin, actually, if you have a Swiss watch versus a German watch, there might be some connection you feel to that country. Mechanically, what are the complications? How was it made? Was it made industrially or was it made by hand? You might feel certain connections to the brand. Like, it's a very rich world, and I think that's why it draws so many people in and captures their attention for so long. And it's kind of beautiful that everyone can basically pick and choose what are the important aspects of this entire hobby to me, and how does this relate to me?
Yeah.
What I'm also interested in, right, is this notion of, as we're talking about the new luxury and the new people who are starting to collect watches now and get into fashion as a whole, something I think a lot about is a term, I'd like to call the drip to price ratio when it comes to items, right? Which is, for watches, it's like someone wearing a Batman is, very much a signifier of wealth. But then if you're a real head, you see someone in an FP Journe Resonance, it's like, oh, okay, this person is on a different ball game. In the same way that, an Hermes Birkin bag is relatively classic, but then a pair of Louis Vuitton Air Force Ones signifies something else because it's access and aspiration at once. And so I'm interested in how you've seen that evolve as, the so-called old status symbols are replaced with new ones, and we'll get into the whole new collaborative paradigm of the watch world as well.
It's interesting you say old status symbols in the watch world, because an old status symbol in the watch world would have been a pocket watch. And we don't see those around anymore, right? Actually, it's surprising how many watches used to be really important and then stopped being important. And I think given how many collectors have actually gone into this in the last couple of years, they don't yet have that historical context.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see their perspective on these things. Like Frank Mueller, right? Mm-hmm. Frank Mueller was so hot, and now it's not anymore. But maybe we'll have its heyday again, too. Small dress watches. I was having a conversation with an older banker, an older senior banker, and he was saying, when I was coming up, like, the thing to have as that successful senior banker was a fine 3940, right? And like the 3940, I don't think is seen in that way anymore. It's seen more as like, oh, this is like the smart collector's choice. But it's not seen as the ubiquitous status symbol it was before. But society changes, right? Culture changes.
I know this is something we've talked a lot about, and
Yeah.
so, especially seeing that there's Supreme Vuitton next to some really nice watches,
Yeah.
on display. I'm interested in how that paradigm plays out.
Yeah, I mean, the hype culture and the Supreme that's come into Christie's in the last couple of years is new. It's new for an older auction house. We took the leap and we felt like it was going to be a success, and it is so much of a success that this month we're actually launching our new Department X, which is sneakers and collectibles, because the market is just growing in so many new ways. And it's really amazing to see, and it's a pleasure to be able to offer these items at Christie's.
Gabe, any thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, it's, I don't know anything about culture or fashion. I mean, look at me. I mean, God, travesty. But I do spend a lot of time in watch culture. And what's interesting is it's not immune. I think as hardcore watch enthusiasts, of course we come at this from a place of pure love and curiosity and excitement. But let's be honest, there's a hype culture within watch culture. It might not be chasing a Rolex Batman
Right.
or a Daytona. It could be. And that's not to say if you have one of those watches or you want one or you're into it for the wrong reasons. Of course, those are great watches. But there is a hype culture within watches, and maybe to some extent, collective is part of that. But we can all name on one hand those niche brands that have a lot of hype, have a lot of excitement, and whether we particularly love the watches or not, we feel a sense of fear of missing out if we don't buy one the minute it becomes available. No one on the street is going to recognize the Hodinkee collaboration on your wrist. But you know if you don't buy it and you're not ready at 11:59 and 59 seconds, you might miss out on it. And that's part of the driving force of purchasing something. And that's no disrespect, that's just a fact. And I'm guilty of the same thing. I've been the guy hovering with my mouse and 2 computers going and 5 screens. I get it. So there's different forms of hype culture.
Yeah, there is, and I think something, as someone whose frame of reference is like sneakers and streetwear and fashion, one thing that I think is in common with watches is, you can resell pieces of your collection, or you can sell it. It's a self-funding hobby in that sense, right? It's like if you're a foodie, you can't necessarily resell a meal you've eaten at a Michelin-star restaurant. There's no value after the fact that it's been used, but in watches and certain other hobbies that have now become, valuable commodities in some ways, NFT culture is another analog in that. The hobby sort of funds itself and becomes a means to sustain itself. Any thoughts on that, Mark? What I'm getting to is how to develop taste, which is going to be the next question.
Oh, sure. I definitely appreciate the fact that you can kind of self-fund the hobby. I had this conversation with someone recently, not about watches, about cigars.
Right.
Because cigars is something that I kind of enjoy. And I was like, and he's a big cigar collector. And I was like, how would you create a collection of cigars that you could smoke forever and ever and ever? And how much would it cost? And he's like, well, I treat it the same way I treat wine, for instance. Like, I buy 3 boxes of everything I want to smoke. I estimate out how many sticks I would smoke a year, and then I would think about, I got to age this 5 years, so I got to build up a stock of 5 years, right? So it came to about 4,500 cigars, and it would cost you it's a crazy amount of cigars. But the idea was that he would smoke 1 box and sell the other 2 boxes, smoke 1 box, sell the other 2 boxes, and it would just perpetuate. And he was like, yeah, it would cost you about $500,000, but you would never have to pay for a cigar ever again. And I was like, that's a lot of money, but on the other hand, like, it's not that bad an investment, right?
When
you
you're
never have to
using
pay.
it so much.
Yeah, like you'll get a little bit of extra change on the side, and you'll always have something to smoke.
Well, you always talk about, my husband also, Jaron, with you, about price per wear, right?
Right.
So I think, if you're going to wear a watch every day, or you're going to wear that shirt all the time, it depends, it's relative on how much you spend on it.
Right.
Well, just to add, I'm sorry, time is a really important factor in these things. You need things to age in order to really gain value. I mean, I think this is what kind of disgusts us about flipper culture, where you buy something today and you sell it a minute later. But inevitably, if you have good things and they're limited in quantity or production, they will grow in value. And you often can get to a point in your life where you don't really need that thing. It's actually gotten to a value that's exceeded its purpose to you. So why don't you move on from that and start over? Because I think for a lot of collectors, the fun is finding the thing in the first place, finding it before someone else does, or finding just the right variant of it and getting to enjoy that honeymoon process over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I buy the whole thing of watches as certainly not investment or even self-funding.
Right.
I think that's a relatively recent phenomenon or perception. And this is the part of the talk where I rag on my mother-in-law. my wonderful mother-in-law was a collector, and it came from a place of, again, genuine love and curiosity and excitement about these things. Was a collector of antique furniture in the 1990s. Guess what the value of all her antique furniture is today? It's a fraction of what it was. And that's actually a very painful financial reality for her, because she was hoping that this furniture would at least hold its value or be some kind of investment or some kind of self-funding tool. It's not. Now, I'm not saying watches aren't, but I think it's really important to remember that a lot of the discussion around watches as an investment is a relatively recent thing, and the pendulum swings both ways. If aliens from outer space look down on us buying and selling watches and making money or getting out of them for half of what we paid, and that's good enough, they'd think we were crazy. It's not a productive asset. So in culture, I think the pendulum can swing, and it could swing back and the tide on watches could come out, and then it could come back in. We can't predict the future. But what's great about a room of people like this is I don't think that's the motivation. You know, no one would come to this panel, this place, to be with other people if that's all you cared about. And so, you know, approaching this as a hobby and a forum for curiosity and thinking about price per wear, I think, is a great way to think about that too.
Yeah, well, going on with that too, you know, it's interesting you brought up furniture because it's something I'm thinking about a lot. Growing up in a Filipino household, right, that had plastic covered furniture. So people who collect plastic cover, you know, people
can get
who
that
collect
for your
it,
watches too.
and
You know?
exactly,
Yeah.
right. It's like treating it too much like a commodity, you sort of forget to enjoy it, right, which is the downside of things having a value. And let's talk about that because I know, Mark, you know, you're an expert in vintage watches. You started.
I don't know about an
with
expert,
with
but
that.
I
Well,
try.
you started in vintage watches.
I did.
And you still, you know, buy vintage as well.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in that sort of, you know, kind of developing that knowledge base in, you know, not necessarily it's in wearing your watches and
Yeah.
enjoying them.
No, absolutely. I guess for developing taste and knowledge, I think it's really important to obviously look around as much as possible. I mean, actually, auction previews are a wonderful thing to go to because it's a chance for you to see a lot of very varied things and also a lot of very varied condition. And when you start to see different condition, then it allows you much easier to identify what's good condition, what's bad condition. But in terms of developing taste, I think it's really nice to look a lot, study a lot, read a lot, and own a lot. And I don't mean like you have to hoard everything, but I mean like take the financial pain of like buying something, try it out for a while, and if it doesn't work out, it's catch and release, right?
You just wrote about this, right, for
I
Die Work.
did write
right?
for
And I was
it.
going to ask you specifically about this. There's a Chinese phrase you referred to that sort of refers to, you know, paying school fees.
Yeah.
Right? Basically.
Yeah.
I always like to say every great wardrobe is also built on a foundation of expensive mistakes.
Yeah.
So
You're totally right. Yeah.
Let's talk about what do you mean by that?
So there's a Chinese phrase called 交学费, and 交学费means like you're paying school fees. And so the idea is that like if you make a mistake, you didn't really lose anything. You just had to pay a little bit more for your education along the way. And I find that like a really charming phrase and a nice thing to live by for sure.
Rebecca, any thoughts on that?
Just, you know, you were touching on how auction previews can be a really good way to come into the market and understand different conditions and different price points. I think a lot of people are put off by auctions and they find them sometimes a little bit nerve-wracking.
That's why you just go to the preview.
We're very nice people. There is no need to be scared. But we do also have, you know, we have bespoke service, which we call private sales, where you can buy and sell your watches privately. But there's also different types of auctions. You know, they're not always the highest priced watches. And I think we are trying to cater to a lot of different parts of the market and areas of the market, and I would encourage you to come along. And even just the experience of coming to the live auction is a luxury in itself. You can meet your friends and colleagues there, discuss watches in the community. It's just a really nice place to be.
Well, speaking of community, Gabe, I'm interested in your personal journey into watches and founding Collective Horology, you know, especially within Silicon Valley, where, you know, there's a lot of people who are new to watches, and, you know, it was an underserved market, I believe, in the New York Times article, right?
Yeah, well, you know, my journey into watches started with that Ziploc bag of watches in Brooklyn, and I ended up moving later in life to California. I live in LA now, but I lived for about 15 years in San Francisco and Oakland. And one of the things that kept me going, so my business partner and co-founder of Collective is Asher Rapkin. And he and I met each other here in New York City in the 7th grade homeroom in the Trinity School on the Upper West Side. And watches was a thing that kept us connected as friends. I moved to California, he stayed here, and watches, that shared passion for watches is actually what kept us connected as friends. And as soon as he moved to California, I had a friend in my same geographic area who shared a passion for watches. It was no longer this lonely hobby to be conducted only on the internet. And that led us together to starting a couple of different watch collector groups in the Bay Area, and then ultimately starting Collective. And the genesis of it was, one, just a passion about watches, but two, trying to find other people who share that passion to spend time with, because 99% of people look at that thing on your wrist or know that you're interested in watches, and man, at best, they're perplexed. At worst, they think you're a moron.
Or your wife is like, please stop talking to me about this.
I do like the notion of paying school fees, though. It makes me feel a lot less guilty and does assuage my bruised ego greatly.
You know, with clothing, right, you always kind of have to take risks. Because otherwise, you don't really develop stylistically, right? So you always take these risks, but inevitably, there'll be a very high chance of failure. And so maybe this is your own psychological defense for like why you can keep doing that.
What do you classify as a failure?
Well, like that olive leather jacket wasn't a terribly good idea. I paid my school fees on that one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You tried to sell me that olive leather jacket.
I'm sure there's Yeezys you have like hidden away somewhere too.
Oh yeah,
Awesome.
so many, so many.
I think what we're also getting at too is knowledge, right? It's become a form of luxury in some way, and especially when vintage and for new customers that are coming into the watch market, something that we've learned at Nordstrom working with Watchfinder to help curate our vintage watch selection. But I'm curious, right? In addition to school fees, there's this idea of sort of buying your way into the community for credibility in some ways, right? And sometimes you might regret that purchase later. But I guess my question is of the two, knowledge versus becoming a patron and becoming a regular client, how do you weigh the importance of both in sustaining a successful and enriching community?
I think the time and energy contribution is the most important, but you can't get away from the fact that you got to put some money down on the table at some point as well, right? Because I don't think you'll reach that next level until you really get to like have it in your hand, study it, and build and kind of an emotional connection to it, really. Like what Malcolm Gladwell said about 10,000 hours. I think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about mass-produced product like clothing, you can buy into it. You can buy into the trend. You can be a bait on a very expensive farm. Or you can, defy the trend, set your own values and your own rules, and sort of go beyond that. And I think with that, if you do the latter, you will create a deeper appreciation for the product and a deeper connection to that story. And, that product has its own story, especially if it's a vintage piece, and it can add to yours too.
Yeah. Well, and Gabe, that's like sort of one of the pieces about collective horology, right? Some of the collaborations you guys have done are limited to 50 pieces or less, but then once someone acquires one, then they're sort of a member for life. Can you explain a bit about the community you guys have built?
Yeah, sure. So, Collective, we call it a social club for watch enthusiasts, and it's just a different kind of watch club or watch community. And what makes it different are two things. One is our calling card and the thing we're known for, sort of the flag of Collective, our collaborative watches. So in the last 5 years, we've done about 5 collaborative watches with everyone from IWC to Urwerk and everything in between. And the way it works is whenever we do a new collaboration, we offer it first to existing members. And so this is what part of what I mean about luxury as access, right? If you're a member of Collective, if you've supported past projects, if you participate in the group and the community, the access you get is first dibs on the next piece. Now, you don't have to buy it. You become a Collective member just by buying one piece, and there are pieces at different price points and styles and things like that. So there's no ongoing dues. There's no pressure to buy a watch you don't want. But by buying one, you get this form of access. Whatever remains after members have their first dibs, whatever remains is then opened up. And one of the things we try to manage is hype culture in the watch community. So when we put watches up for sale to the general public, we have an application process, and that's not meant to exclude people. It's not meant to be some rich bitch thing. It's not meant to be onerous or difficult. We just ask one question, which is, tell us why you love watches. And so what that allows us to do are filter out flippers, people who just want the watch. What we want to understand is, of course, we understand if you want to buy a watch from us, we're asking you to spend in some cases anywhere from $5,000 in the case of Urwerk to $63,000. That's a lot of money. And so we don't put a velvet rope in front of it to exclude people. We just ask people to take a beat and think about, do you really want this watch? And do you want to be a part of this community? And that allows us to, hopefully, and it's worked so far, we're always open to changing it, it's allowed us to avoid a little bit of that fear of missing out, because it takes a little bit longer to sell out a watch when you have an application and you ask people to stop and write something, and then our members review it. We don't make I don't make the decision, Asher doesn't make the decision who gets access into Collective, our members do. So it takes a little longer, but it's our way of making sure we're bringing great people into the community, being as inclusive as possible, and two, trying to avoid a lot of that hype culture and that fear of missing out that often happens with these limited watches.
Now, let's talk about collaborations, because it used to be that, that line between access and aspiration. It was like Omega and Swatch coming together to make the Moon Swatch at a relatively accessible price point. To in the sneaker world, Riccardo Tisci, when he was at Givenchy, making an Air Force One that was within Nike pricing, or Kim Jones doing the same thing. The new wrinkle is luxury and luxury collaborations. You had Tiffany and Patek coming together. Audemars has worked with Casablanca, Alix, and other high-end fashion labels on just really high-end pieces. And of course, we had mentioned sneakers before, like Dior and Air Jordan, and Vuitton and Air Force One, making pieces at Vuitton price points. So I'm interested in what place do these new partnerships play, where who's getting what out of it, and what does it say about how that community has evolved for consumers looking for hype new product?
I mean, there's the matter of relevance. I think relevance is really important. One brand's relevance may not be applicable to another brand's, but when you put the two together, then you have potential to expand your customer base. But beyond that kind of more cynical view of it, I think it's really interesting when two interesting brands with strong creative directions put their minds together and create something that neither could have come up with themselves. I always find that very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think there's no denying that partnerships are good for the brand and good for the audience. I mean, partnerships like Swatch and Omega can interest new collectors that may never have been interested in the watch industry before that. It's a good gateway for a lot of people to enter the industry. But I think the question really becomes the longevity of it all, the longevity of these partnerships. How long do they last? What is the impact of them? And was it worth it?
Who would you say the audience for these really specific collaborations are, right? It's like the only time I've ever seen, that 5711 Nautilus was on the wrist of like a Jay-Z or Alexander Arnault, and it's clear they have an in with Tiffany at this point. So who would you say the audience is?
Well, it depends on the partnership, right? I think for Swatch and Omega, they obviously Swatch clearly have their own market mapped out. But I think there were clients, very young clients, coming to me asking me where they can get it, how they can get it, and it's been a foray for them to come into the community, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Mark, any thoughts?
No. I have nothing to add. She covered everything perfectly.
I've thought like way too much about this space of collaborations, and hope maybe this applies just beyond watches, but all I think about is watches.
Right.
It's sick. And I thought about like what is the nature of a collaboration, and what makes a good one that's valuable to people, that people would actually care about. And so I've broken it down into like this. What are those overlapping charts? Venn diagrams.
Venn diagrams, yes.
You guys like Venn diagrams? Here we go. So
there's also the meme of the two hands that are crossed from like Predator.
Oh, that's cool.
One.
That's
Nice
a lot
cross-section.
cooler.
Yeah.
That's a lot cooler. I'm not up for that. So I think of like there's these three building blocks of watch collaborations. There are limited edition things, there are collaborations, and then there are things that are driven by ideas or concepts. And I think the best collaborations do all three. So that's right why there's a Venn diagram. There's an overlap. And what does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of collaborations tend to be limited in number because of the nature of those kinds of projects, not just in watches, but in these other categories as well. Now, they're limited in number. Two, what actually makes them a collaboration? Well, they have the fingerprints of all of the parties involved in there. You can see the influence of one of the collaborators on the other and vice versa. You see the fingerprints of the maker. Now, there are limited edition watches that are great, but you don't necessarily see the fingerprints of both of the collaborators, right? Maybe there's a watch that just has a different dial variant. Well, what does that have to do with the two folks coming together? The third thing is this idea of having a creative idea or a concept. And this is where things really get interesting. So you see the fingerprints of both, it's limited, but then it's expressing a unique idea. And I think this is what really make collaborations meaningful, relevant, and useful, and what I think people should really care about. I don't think it's enough for two brands to get together and make something. It has to express something new. It has to have a thought, or like Mark is saying, a narrative, a story, a concept around it. So I'll give an example. One of my favorite watch collaborations was by Zodiac and Worn and Wound. And it was a limited edition watch. It was a collaboration where you could very much see the DNA of Zodiac's brand and their use of color, and you could very much see Worn and Wound's design influence on it as well, if you're familiar with their collabs. The creative concept was a nod to sort of the trapper-keeper culture of the 1990s. So it played with colors and textures and geometry. And to me, it's like it nailed the thing. It's like, well, why did Worn and Wound and Zodiac need to get together to do something? Because they got together to express an idea that only they could together, that never would have existed without them. So those are my beautiful mind ramblings on this stuff. But I think it starts to ask the question of like, who are these for, and who would care about it? Why do it?
Right.
I mean, speaking of collaborations, where I think two really strong creative forces came together, because this is one that I always mention. I think it's so good. The Urwerk Lauren Ferrier collaboration was amazing. You know, taking Urwerk's format with the Star Wheel, but then taking Lauren Ferrier's organic forms and putting those two things together was the most genius thing I've ever seen. And actually, now I think about it, Renaissance and Alan Silverstein.
Oh yeah.
That one is also killer.
Yeah,
that is
awesome.
an amazing collaboration. Like, because all the Silversteins are almost a little too fun, but somehow with the Renaissance and with that deep color that the Silverstein has, like, it works perfectly. You know, I don't know if I should say this on camera, but the problem with, I love Renaissance. I think what they do is so interesting. I think that it's hard for surprisingly a lot of people to take Renaissance seriously if they don't understand watchmaking, because it doesn't look fancy enough. And that Silverstein splash of color and quirkiness actually manages to push it past the line to like, wow, this is something that every man or every woman, no matter what their income, should try and own, you know?
I think, Mark, what's clear is that you have such a personal connection to your collection, which is why, you know, a lot of people were surprised to know that you're actually selling it, a good portion of it next week.
You know, oh, sorry, please.
Well, I was going to ask about, you know, one of the collaborations that I think I've seen you talk about at length is the Tadao Ando Bulgari. And you have such a story with all your watches. I just want to know, what does ownership mean now, right? Is it like when you see something, you're sort of ready to let go, see it go to a new home, right? That's something that guys in menswear and people who own watches talk about a lot, is, you know, it brings someone a sense of joy when after I've sort of had my time with it and have told my story with this, it's time to sort of pass it on.
You have to bear with me. I can wax lyrical about this. So, firstly, oh no, I had too much stuff. I can't remember what I was going to say now.
Like, even if it's not yours anymore, is it still, like, what was?
I remember now. So I'll give you an interesting story. I received as a gift, not an expensive watch, but a very interesting watch. And I never wore it. It was very rare. It wasn't expensive, it was rare. And I was like, well, I never wear it. And I was really happy I got this as a gift. But I think I'm going to let it go. I'm going to sell it. And then I mentioned to a mutual friend, hey, I'm going to let this thing go. And the guy's like, no, what are you doing? You can't sell a gift like that. I'm like, but I never wear it. And like, if I get the money, I'll give it back to the guy. It's fine, right? And the guy's like, you absolutely cannot do that. And, you know, this is my own perverted mind working. Like, for me, if you're going to gift something, me giving it to you, that's the end of it. Like, I gain the satisfaction from that experience of giving it to you, and the physical object is no longer part of the equation anymore. And I actually feel more and more like that about watches too. Like, at some point, I'm just like, I had the watch, it's gone, it's fine. Like, what was more important to me is I had the experience, and somehow the experience to me is actually even more permanent than owning the physical thing. Strange as it may sound.
Rebecca, any thoughts?
No. So I just wanted to ask you, Mark, on that thought, how do you feel about auctioning your collection this season?
I'm not that bothered, to be honest.
But is the experience really over, like, as you say, taking over the physical ownership?
I think the auction one's a little bit different because I have a specific intention in mind. Like, I'm selling a bunch of my watches because I want to try and buy myself a property for the Armoury. And so I don't even see it as like this is a sad thing.
Yeah.
I see this as a very happy thing. Like, this is another development in my life, you know? And I love my watches, but I love my business even more than my watches.
Yeah.
And so to trade from one into the other is trading up to me. It's not even trading sideways, it's trading up.
Yeah,
to
I
me.
think that's a great point, actually. A lot of my clients, they do feel very attached to their watches, of course, and they have a lot of meaning associated to them. And letting them go it shouldn't be the end of that journey. I think putting that into something else or buying another watch that only memorializes their collecting journey is like kind of the best part about it.
Right.
There has been like a long-standing stigma, and I suspect it's getting a little bit better in watch culture around selling watches. Now, I don't know about selling a gift.
I chose not to sell the gift in the end
All right.
because I couldn't take the risk.
But
Everyone told me I was crazy as well.
there is a stigma, and it's not, and so I think there's a bit of a stigma around selling watches when it's time to move on. And Mark, the reason you just articulated for auctioning part of your collection, that's a really beautiful and meaningful reason to do something. Like, that's awesome. We should be celebrating that. You feel good about it. We should be
feel good,
celebrating.
yeah.
Like, that's so cool.
Yeah.
And that's important, and it's meaningful to you and to your people who work for the Armoury and all your stakeholders and all that stuff. So often, however, there's a culture in watch collecting that's very anti-selling things. It's a dirty thing to do. Don't sell watches. I'm not a flipper, and the brands participate in this too. A lot of retailers will give you guilt. You're not going to sell this watch if I sell it. And I'm not talking about flipping, but
Right.
There's the holding the card for a year kind of thing. What I find so horrifying about that is, one, these are people's personal property for which they've spent a lot of money. Two, their luxury items are meant to be enjoyed, and there may come a time when it's time to move on for the other thing. And three, it's not really anyone's business what you do with your personal property. No one should give you a hard time for moving on from part of your collection because you're doing something really meaningful and important with that. And so I hope we can, in the watch industry and culture, destigmatize watch selling. Oh, and by the way, it's what keeps the industry going. So often, people are selling watches to get into the next watch. This is the lubricant that keeps watch collecting going. So I'm glad that you're so transparent about it, and I think it's amazing that you're sharing why, because I think that goes a long way to destigmatizing the act of selling a watch, which has been a very verboten thing for a long time.
I mean, that's the whole thing. That was the whole Rolex tagline, right? You never really own a Rolex. You really take care of it for the next generation.
Patek.
That was
Patek, yeah, Patek.
That's right.
Yeah, it's kind of true. Weirdly, like I sell my personal clothes from time to time. We have a secondhand shop.
Yeah.
So I sell some of my personal clothes when I'm selling through the secondhand shop. I actually really feel more attached to who the next owner of my personal clothes are than my watches. I'm not as bothered. I haven't figured that out yet.
Sure. All right. Thank you guys so much for being on this panel. I think we have some time for some questions.
Hey, Gabe, this question's for you. It's funny. I feel like you almost contradicted yourself with what you just said about selling.
probably.
You did. Well, because you mentioned about, if you guys put a watch up that's maybe a collaboration, you send out an application. Okay. And you said, we asked this question, like, why do you really want this watch? Why do you really love this watch? And this helps to avoid flippers. But then you just said that selling a watch is okay. So that's the first thing I want to say.
Sure.
The question is, do you not realize that flippers can also be really eloquent, and that there are a lot of flippers that might even be in this room that also love watches?
Sure.
So what happens when you find out, potentially, that a person got this watch that you and the membership committee said, or not you, but like your members said, like, yeah, this person should get it, and then they flip it? Do you kick them out of the club? Like,
No,
what,
quite-
you go
quite
like,
the
hey, No
opposite.
more drinks for you. Like, what? How do you handle that?
Yeah, quite the opposite. So it's a good question. Thank you for calling me out on my bullshit. Appreciate that. It's what happens when you get up on stage with a mic attached to your face, get drunk with power. So the application question is, why do you love watches? Not the particular watch in particular, but I'll let that go. So we actually have a pre-owned business at Collective. So Collective has a shop. We created the shop to retail our collaborative watches, so we could essentially act as our own authorized dealer. Once we set that up, where we built all the infrastructure and the ability to retail our watches, we realized that two things. One, we didn't want to stigmatize members who were ready to move on from their watches. So part of the rules from Collective are, if you buy a watch specifically to flip it, in other words, to buy it and sell it immediately, that's not cool with us. We've actually had that happen once, and in 5 years, not so bad. But if someone wants to sell a watch because, I'll give an example, they've had a horrible family tragedy, and they need to help with medical bills for someone, of course we should help them sell it. So we do make it possible for our members to sell the watch. We tell them you can sell it in the Facebook group for Collective first. We don't make any money off of that. You can sell it on the forums. You can sell it to a dealer. You can sell it any way you want. You can also reach out to us and ask us if we'd like to buy it and sell it. So I think I would make a distinction between buying a hype watch with the express goal of turning it around the next day to make money versus moving on from a watch, and that could be just in a matter of months, or it could be in a matter of weeks. I think one of the things I've learned in basically selling pre-owned watches is a lot of times people need to sell their watches for perfectly good reasons. Usually it's because they want another watch. That's okay, keeps the industry going. But usually there are perfectly good reasons, whether it's horrible tragedies or doing something more meaningful in their life, or it just wasn't for them. And so I don't think we should hold anyone hostage with their watches.
Carrying on from that question is, on occasions, I have really looked forward to getting a watch, and it's taken me ages to get it, and I get it on my wrist, and I hate the damn thing.
I have been there.
Yeah. So, that's not flipping a watch, that's getting rid of a watch.
Sure, that's getting rid of a watch. And I think the challenge with Collective is unique, where we sell limited edition watches, and we make them publicly available, and they're typically either ready to ship or ready to ship within a shorter period of time. And what we've seen is we've seen from other people who have a similar business model that it can attract a lot of people doing it without the right intentions. There's nothing wrong with getting a watch and realizing it's not for you. I've been there, and I think the first question. So in the example of the person who flipped one of our watches, the first thing we did was ask, because I don't want to assume someone is flipping a watch for bad reasons. And it turned out that the person who did that was a gray market dealer who bought it with the intention of making money. And that's different from someone saying to me, you know what, it's just not for me. And that's okay. If you spent X thousands of dollars on a watch and it's just not for you, you shouldn't be held hostage.
That was my postscript to the original question. Now I'm going to come out with my real question, which is, do you think the idea of having grail watches is a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know. I had a grail watch for a long time, and then I owned it and I experienced it.
Yeah, because it's attaining the grail that matters, not actually owning it.
In the case of my grail watch, I won't name names. Two interesting things happened. One was I owned it, and I really did enjoy it, but maybe not in the way I thought I was. It was a little bit similar to the experience you had. And then two, about a little more than a year after purchasing it, I needed to sell it to fund something in my personal life. And I did, and I got in trouble with the brand for selling it. And I was asked to provide this brand with an explanation, which I couldn't believe. And the explanation, actually, in my case, was a family tragedy. And that was one of those moments that really reframed the way I think about this. And I'm glad that there's questions about this because it's not black or white. It's not like you're a flipper or you're not a flipper. Life is complicated. So that's the way it goes, I guess.
Did you provide the explanation?
I debated should I provide the explanation or not, and I did. And it's funny, I never heard back. Yeah, it was an unfortunate situation.
Yeah, I'm interested in Rebecca's
I
point of
think
view on that.
it's for a Grail watch. I think it's really important to have Grail pieces to aspire to. I don't think they necessarily have to be the Paul Newman or the most expensive watch on the market or the one that you really can't get, that's in limited supply or quantity. Or I just think it's nice to have those goals, aspirations. My personal Grail at the moment, which I'm trying to get, is a 5110P. Just really want the world time. And that will probably change in a couple of months, and then I'll be on to the next thing. But it's really nice for me to have that journey to get there, to enjoy it all along the way, and just to keep going on that path. That's what I enjoy.
I'm actually interested, Mark, too, in what does that mean in terms of how do you develop your own canon, right? Because I think for you, Grail is different, and it's for everybody it's different, right? When I think about your tantalum Patek and how you went with the quartz because you were specifically looking for
the Royal
small-
Oak.
Exactly.
Yeah. A lot of my favorite watches were not my Grail watches. They were just watches I fell into, and I think that's the best way to go about things. Actually, I think that when you obsess over things, it's really easy to overestimate how great it'll be when you finally get it. Whereas if you just fall into something and you happen to like it, you kind of grow with it. Every day actually gets a little bit better, rather than every day you're a little bit oh, okay, I'm starting to get a little bit bored of this.
But what if you actually get it and you don't think, oh no, it's terrible, but you think, wow, that was so worth it?
Good for you, Rebecca.
I think grill watches can be helpful in that they sort of can put blinders on. Right. I'm a bit like Mark, and this is dangerous for me financially sometimes. Things will come up, a watch will come up serendipitously, and I'll be curious about it or fall in love with it. What's helpful about a Grail watch is it puts these blinders on. I'm on a mission for that thing, and so maybe that's a little bit better on the pocketbook.
Well, I think that when you have something like a Grail watch, like an idealized thing, it's really hard to notice the downsides of it. Can I talk shit about your Grail watch for 1 second?
If you have to.
Please.
Okay. The 5110P, I love it as well. The size is wonderful. I love the hands. But when you have that dark gray in the center with the hands on top of it,
guilloche?
yeah.
What's wrong with the guilloche?
Well, I can't see the damn time.
You don't need to see the time.
I need to see the time.
I don't think I would actually use it in different cities.
No, fair enough. Okay.
I mean, it's beautiful.
It is very beautiful. I know it's very beautiful. That's why I wanted it also.
I'm going to squash it. I'm going to squash that.
No, please. Please, you should get it and then tell me how inaccurate I am.
I'm
Because
sure
I
you'll wanna
would prefer
borrow
to
it
be
when
proved
I
wrong.
do.
Yeah, we have
sell
time
it
for
to
one
me.
more
Sell it to
question.
me.
Sure.
I can break this up. Hey, Mark. You guys kind of skirted around the idea of hype culture, and you all seem to suggest that it's bad in some way. But what I also wanted to point out was that if you try to break down what hype culture really is, the idea that people want something, there's very little of it, or it's difficult to get, and that people are going to try and make a buck off of that. That's always going to exist in the luxury industry. So what parts of it do you think are unhealthy or actually bad, and how much of hype culture do you think the luxury industry really needs or cannot survive without?
I feel strongly about this. So the luxury industry is very much built on wanting stuff. And what really I dislike about hype culture is how amped up that feeling gets, how amped up that feeling of I must have this. Because there's nothing in life you need to have that badly, everything is kind of a luxury these days. We live pretty comfortable lives. And I just don't think it's good for your mental health, to want something so badly and to have that take up your attention like that. Although now I feel like this topic has taken up my attention. Anyway, But you know, like this is why when the Armoury does it, it's collabs. We try to sell by lottery so that everyone has a fair chance. And we also try to give people a really long time to think about it. So we usually have like 2 to 3 weeks worth of sort of a waiting period, almost like a cooling off period, so that some people will be like, you know what, I thought I wanted it, I don't really want it. You know, because I would rather people, if they finally buy anything, feel at peace with it, rather than wishing it was this, but it's actually this, you know. And this is the same thing with the Grail watch, with the Grail watch mentality for me.
I mean, I think fundamentally the thing about hype culture is the shift in, I mean, I've met people in lines. You know, some of my friends, they had an old school experience waiting for the Omega Swatch because they waited in line till the wee hours of the morning until it came out and they bought it at retail. And that sort of knowledge, right? We talked about this of knowledge being a form of luxury. How that's evolved into, you know, now a shoe costs $2,500 at retail instead of a $150 shoe automatically having 800% ROI. And so I think the sort of thing about hype culture and luxury is when it's all about the numbers and becomes a commodity, right? You lose the cultural aspect. You lose the community aspect. You know, it was something where it began with a pretty organic community of people who knew where to get certain items. And now you have shows like, I think it was like She-Hulk, where somebody has like a drip broker, which is now such a mainstream pop cultural thing, where connecting and the idea of being so connected to culture and connecting people to product has become such a commonplace thing.
Yeah. No, I'll just add, I think it is pretty exclusionary. And we're trying to be more inclusive with the new luxury. So it's just ironic, really.
Right. Cool. Well, thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you for everybody for joining us today.